Just a little bit of interaction. Quick show of hands. Not yet. I haven't asked the question. Who has used the NEC form in the past? So anyone used it? Okay, so about half or so of the room. And who's currently actively using it on their live projects of those who have? Okay, still about half again at most. This brief presentation, there's a fair amount to sort of really understanding and using the contract. In 30, 40 minutes, only so much I can run through. But just to give you a little bit of a flavour and to home in on a few of the aspects. So we're going to look at the relationship between project controls and the contract, the objectives of the NEC form as a whole. Anyone who saw my stand during the day, you'd have seen a whole array of NEC contracts. There's lots of them. So we're just going to look at the key objectives and home in on program aspects. So how the program under the contract is a lot more prescriptive than other forms of contract you've probably used. And an age-old question I get, who owns the float on the program, on the project? So we'll go into a bit of depth as to who indeed owns that float. And talk briefly about acceptances of programs. One of the key elements is that you need this accepted program on your projects, and it's one of the key drivers that the NEC form of contract is trying to focus upon. Briefly, GMH Planning, just as a company, we provide over 12 years' experience of working under this form of contract. I've worked predominantly as a planner as well, so I've got good planning background, and most of these projects have been under the NEC form for this period. So we offer training consultancy, also looking after contractors' programs as well, bringing it to the fore and then maintaining it for the life of the project. And the website that I've now got, there's a lot of free guidance material and downloads on there. So it was only launched last week. So like John said, just Google these days. So if you Google GMH Planning, you'll find the website, and in particular, the guidance material I'm pretty pleased with. The amount of extra information I've got there for visitors to the site, and free elements to download as well, articles and also free sort of flow charts and things like that to try and help you manage your projects. So what is project controls? Obviously this is what the 2 days has been about, and I googled it as we do just to get a couple of definitions. Now I'd imagine if I asked everyone what project controls was, they probably have a slightly different answer, but just a couple of answers that came up last night. Project controls is a project management control system enabling management to manage projects. Okay, seems fairly nice, simple words. And project controls function can be summarised as plan, measure, evaluate, report, mitigate, and then manage the change. Okay, it sounds easy, doesn't it? Underpinning these processes, you will have a contract to follow. So everything that you've looked at over the last couple of days in terms of project controls, there will be a form of contract that you need to be following. This is the NEC, the ECC contract. You may be working under a JCT or an ICE condition, but whatever project you're under, there will be some terms and conditions that you need to be following. And in the background, your project control systems are about how you're managing some of those processes. Sometimes I do find that project controls takes over what the contract actually says you should be doing on your contract. And that's pretty dangerous, frankly, because you're not adhering to what the contract is, and you could find yourself in dispute. So no matter what any management system tells you should do, if that's something against what the contract says, not the best idea. So the processes need to complement rather than conflict with administering your project. Now, in terms of NEC, if we just take the 6 elements that the one person said, to plan, measure, evaluate, report, mitigate and manage change, well, they kind of underpin some of the key contractual processes within the NEC suite of contracts. And just to pick out a few, some of the key NEC processes that will be involved and enhanced by your project control reporting. Communication. There's a big element about the flow of communication that exists between the parties. We've got this early warning mechanism. We think there might be a problem on the project. You need to formally raise it to the other party's attention. So that's an important process. Program. This, unlike any other form of contract that I'm aware of, is a lot more prescriptive as to how you should be managing your program and what kind of content you should be putting in there. And then we've got these things called compensation events. So this is the change management mechanism under the contract. So if the contractor is entitled possibly to cost or time, then it will only be through a compensation event. If an event occurs that is not a compensation event, the contractor by default will not be entitled to any time or cost. So they're the key processes, or some of the key processes within the NEC suite, and they're very heavily entrenched within the project controls arena. I'm going to focus on program for this 20 minutes or however long, half an hour we've got. So I'm going to focus on just some of the program elements and how the NEC focuses on how it should be administered. Before I do go into program, the very first contract clause, which bizarrely, rather than clause 1, is actually clause 10.1, just the way they've structured the contracts. The first contract clause tells us that the employer, the contractor, the project manager and the supervisor shall act as stated in this contract. And then it goes on to say, and in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. Now, a couple of people who put their hands up who said, yes, we'll use this contract, there's a couple of wry smiles appeared on their particular faces, because it's like, yeah, we all know about that one. What does it actually mean? Well, it wasn't in the original NEC contract, the last bit, in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. The first bit tells us we need to do what the contract says. So we need to do what is required of us, act as the contract states. So if it's asking us to raise early warnings, notify compensation events, issue programs, that's what we need to be doing. It then goes on to say you need to do this in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. Now, the NEC prides itself on being straightforward, easy to understand, and not being subjective. And yet, in the very first contract clause, they put what amounts to a subjective phrase. So what does it mean? Well, for me, it's about working collaboratively, trustfully, not deceitfully, not deliberately inflating additional cost, not deliberately dragging your heels if you're getting paid for things along the way, not slashing a contractor's quotation just because you think you can get away with it. So it's about being sort of honest and true with each other. And if anyone comes to me and says, oh, we're going to dispute because they're not acting in a spirit of trust and cooperation, at that point, normally I can hear the sound of a scraping barrel, because if that's all they've got to go on, well, frankly, that's not very much. So it is an important reminder. It's a reminder that we need to be working together in an open and trustful way. Now, there is one single word in this contract clause that is the single most important word. Now, for those of you who haven't heard me ask this question, a couple of you might have done. For those of you who have never heard me ask this question before, what would you hazard a guess, for your perspective, is the single most important word in this clause? Any offers? There's some very good words. Might be the first time you've seen this clause, but what do you think might be the most important word? Mutual, okay. It's a good word, but it's not my most important word. Any other offers? Spirit, okay. You didn't mean of the drink kind, did you? No. No, it's not spirit, it's not trust. A couple more. Sorry? Cooperation, no, it's not that one. Okay. Well, I realise it is towards the end of the day and we do want to get home, so I'll put you out of your misery. The most important word is actually a fairly innocuous word, and it's this little word down here. It's the word and. And the reason that is the most important word is because so many projects I get involved with, they've replaced that word unwittingly, not physically, but just the way they're acting, they've replaced that word with the word or. If you replace that clause now with the word or, it takes on a whole different meaning. You do what the contract says, or if we get on well with each other and trust each other, thank goodness, we haven't got to administer this pesky contract. We haven't got to raise early warnings. More than one program, I've got to do that as well. So many people, if they get on well with the other party, they think, brilliant, we haven't now got to administer the contract. The NEC does not say or, it says and. And that's one single message that you've got to understand on this project. This particular form of contract is not to be left in a drawer just to get out when there's a problem. This contract is trying to be a proactive management tool to help you on your projects. And that's a really important element. So in terms of program, well, the issues that I find with other forms of program, other forms of contract in terms of managing the program, most of them have a retrospective analysis of time, delay and entitlement, which is subjective always, to say the least. So if you're going back in time, you've then got to come up, remember what was going on at the time and why the delay was what it was, and it's always going to be subjective. You have these guys called forensic planners that charge out an extortionate amount of money, and the clients will have one and the contractor will have one, and they'll come up with a different answer because they use the historical data to kind of suit themselves. So that's not a very good way forward. Other forms of contract have no firm requirement on how to manage the program during the contract. So it's not prescriptive at all how often and what the significance of a revised contract program is. And other forms of contract, ICE particularly, was like this, where you're often comparing a current program to an original baseline program, which now bears no resemblance as to the works actually being done. So that's not very helpful either. The concept of the NEC suite, and in particular the ECC contract, the engineering construction contract, is that every time we issue a program for acceptance, once accepted, that becomes the accepted program, the new contract program, and in effect becomes the new baseline. Now that will horrify a couple of people here at this today, because earned value is their world. And okay, we could still do earned value, because we could still call on old baselines to do those kind of analysis, but in terms of managing the project and in terms of assessing change, we do that against the last accepted program. And that's a really important concept.
Sorry, can I ask a question on that?
Yeah, quick.
Do we mean last accepted program as part of a performance update or just as part of a change?
Everything. Whenever you submit a revised program, which clause 32 tells you you've got to show progress achieved on each operation, the effect upon the remaining works, the effects of implemented compensation events, any other changes the contractor plans to make. So for me, it's a rescheduled program, a new line in the sand as to where you're at that point in time. It's not very often that I put quotes from lawyers in, because normally lawyers they get paid a lot of money, but I don't always agree with what lawyers say. But last year I heard a lawyer say something very sensible, far too sensible for a lawyer, and they described the program as being the beating heart of the contract. And I thought that was a really nice analogy. So it's the beating heart of the contract, and if your heart stops, you die. Now, I don't mean if you don't administer a program you're going to die, of course, but in effect your contract does die. So it's quite a nice analogy. And when I say die, all right, you're still going to go on and do the works, but you're going to have a lot of subjective arguments on that project, and in terms of managing change, well, good luck, because you'll be in the traditional bun fight that we always used to get in at the end of the project. That takes us to clause 31, which is one of the longest clauses within the ECC contract. It gives a big list of things that need to be included on the program issued for acceptance. The first bullet says we need to show starting date, completion date, and key dates. Now, there's not the time to go into the significance of these milestones and what they are today, but completion date is the date at which delay damages will kick in, so that's the date you've got to finish by. Key dates are interim contractual milestones, where you've got to achieve a certain condition by a certain date. It then goes on to talk about planned completion. So the fact it's on a different bullet, different line, just demonstrates that that is a completely different thing. So just very briefly, I just want to explain the difference between those two milestones. This is not one of my more elaborate programs, it has to be said, okay? But it's a nice simple one for the purposes of today. So we've got a very simple 12-week project here. A, B and C form the critical path. B follows A, C can't be done until B is finished. So that takes us to our 12-week completion. And D, E and F have got what we call float, total float, if we're going to go on to C. So they could slip by up to 3 weeks before they're going to affect the critical path. And I've shown a separate plan completion and a separate completion date milestone. Now, under the contract, there's only one mechanism which can ever move out the completion date to the right-hand side, which some of you may well know is these things called compensation events, very specifically implemented, agreed compensation events. And equally, there's only one single mechanism which can ever bring the completion date back, which is, interestingly, not negative compensation events. It is only acceleration. Acceleration under clause 36 of the contract. That's the only two mechanisms that allow you to physically move completion date in the whole of the ECC contract. Whereas plan completion, well, that can be for anything. So it could be contractors' own delays, they could be ahead of progress, weather, all of these factors, anything could instantly be affecting plan completion. So if the contractor was running late with activity A and was overrunning by a week, that's going to have a knock-on effect to B and C, which will mean plan completion is out of week 13, completion date will stay the same at week 12. Whereas if they're ahead of the game and they've finished A in 3 weeks and they've started B a week early, they're now planning to finish that a week early so C can come forward a week. Plan completion equally comes forward a week. So you've got a planned completion of week 11 and a completion date of week 12. So you're basically comparing these two contractual milestones. Planned is where you plan to finish, compared to a contractual completion date that is fixed and will only jump out with compensation events and jump back with acceleration. Very important, it's a real subtlety for those of you on live projects, that we are managing those two milestones, because everything is actually measured against planned completion. Completion date is the byproduct of any change. Back to our list, what else needs to be included on a programme? And just bear this in mind for if you're not using NEC, what contractual requirement there is, because I'd imagine it's nothing as stringent as this. The order and timing of the operations to provide the works. So this is our list of activities and the logic-linked relationship between them. Float and time risk allowances. So we have to show float. Now within the software, whichever software we're using, then float is, as long as you fully logic link your activities, that is created from the software. Time risk allowances is a specific type of float. Individual risk that you, the contractor, have allowed for an individual activity has to be shown on the programme. So that's a second type of float. You also need to show health and safety requirements. And then these last three, which are flashing, are external factors not under the contractor's control, yet they need to be shown on the contractor's programme. So plant and materials from the employer. If the employer is giving any free issue materials, those need to be stated on the programme. If the employer is then late with those materials, we can then show what effect that has had. Acceptances, things like design acceptance, method statements, acceptance of subcontractors, anything that the project manager has to accept, that approval loop, the acceptance loop, needs to be on the programme as well. And information from others. Others is capitalised, which means it's a defined term under the contract. Basically, it's any other third party, any other stakeholder. So anyone else who could affect you in carrying out your works, I'd show that as a milestone on the programme. So that as long as these guys achieve this date by then, we can do our chain of activities down here. And then if they're late, we can then demonstrate, by rescheduling the programme, what effect that has had, if any. And it also goes on to say a statement of how the contractor plans to do the work, identifying principal equipment and resources. So there's words to go with this programme as well. Now I try and do most of that on the programme. I always put resources on a programme, because arguably, how can you really be sure a programme is achievable without having resources on there? I also show principal equipment. If it's a heavy construction project, your excavators, your big bits of kit that you're planning to use, cranes, things like that. That frees my statement to be more of a narrative. So it's the words, really. Every time I submit a programme for acceptance, it's a set of words to describe what's in the programme. It's the black and white words trying to help the project manager to be able to accept that programme, because that's what I want him to do. I want to make it clear why the programme, the schedule, is showing what it's showing, so that he can then accept that, and that becomes the new accepted programme. The project manager has only got 4 reasons not to accept a programme, and he has to accept or not accept. One of the reasons is the contractor's plans which it shows are not practicable. So maybe you're showing outputs that aren't achievable. There's no way you can achieve a certain duration. It doesn't show the information the contract requires. Well, contract requires you to submit a programme that complies with everything in clause 31.2. So if you're not showing float or time risk allowances, then that is a reason for not accepting the programme. It doesn't represent the contractor's plans realistically. Programme says you're going to start at A and work through, do B, C and then D. He looks out the window, you've started D. So clearly that's not the right schedule either. Or it doesn't comply with the works information, some other requirement within the works information. What do you think happens? The project manager's got 2 weeks to accept this programme. What do you think is the status, contractual status of this programme, if after 2 weeks you've not heard a word from the project manager? And you can prove that he's had it, he's definitely had it, and there's no word from him at all. Any offers as to what the status of that programme is? Go on. Okay. I don't know if that's what you thought or what you wanted it to be, but under this form of contract, it's not deemed accepted. There's no such thing as a deemed accepted programme. And indeed, there's hardly any deemed acceptances. There used to be none. There's now 3 to do with compensation events. So that's a really important message, that there's no such thing as a deemed acceptance, so therefore you've got to get the thing across the line. Now the fact the project manager, if he's not responded at all, that then becomes a compensation event. But unfortunately for the contractor, that doesn't help much, because there's nothing to price there because of the last point. Acceptance is not a condition precedent for getting on with the work. So you're still going to be working to your best effect, but it's not a reason you're not going to down tools and stop the work. So another key message there, no deemed acceptance of a program. Sure.
Can you turn it around the other way? And you're saying that the contract is built on a program. What happens if the contractor doesn't submit the program?
Okay. Here's one little tool at your disposal. If you do not have an accepted program, then there's the slight matter of 25% of what the contract calls the price work done to date. So that's their interim assessments. Every 4 weeks or every month, the contractor claims money. Well, there's the slight matter of withholding 25% of his cash flow. Now, would that hurt most contractors, or is cash flow not that important to them? I think it's pretty important. So there's one big tool. So that's one answer to your question. There's a couple of other things, but that's the main one, to be honest. So if you do not have an accepted program, or one submitted that shows all the information the contract requires, so we don't let them off the hook by saying, oh, I've put one in, so you can't withhold the money. Well, hang on, the one you've put is on the back of a cigarette packet, or cereal packet, making it a bit more healthy. But it's either way, it's not very good, so you're not off the hook. You're not showing float, you're not showing time risk allowances. I'm not going to accept it, so therefore I'm going to withhold 25% until such time that you do provide an accepted program. And bizarrely, the next month is normally better. Okay, normally.
With that clause, the word first program.
Yes.
Is that the first submitted and accepted program?
It's.
So then if they issue the program 1 month,
Yep.
they will issue one the next month.
Yep.
Can you still use that clause?
No, it's after. What this is trying to do is, because of the problems you raised there, hopefully if the parties raise the program to the required level once, the intent is that well, surely you'll keep going. But okay, I do accept that it's not always the case. However, there are other recourses for the contractor, against the contractor, if they don't then maintain the program. To put it very simply, if you don't have a subsequent program accepted, the project manager is then entitled to make his own assessment of every compensation event for the rest of that job. Now, whilst that's quite a bit of a job to do you think that project manager is going to have a higher assessment or a lower assessment of the contractor's assessment in each case? So that's not a road the contractor wants to go down. So there are, and we can talk if not the time today, there are other little tools in there to help either party to try and get that across the line. But yes, it's such an important mechanism. This is the only place in the NEC contract that allows the project manager to withhold money to this extent. In fact, at all. Other than retention and delay damages, this is the only area that allows him to do it. And it's just, I say just, but it's for a program. But it recognises how important it is. And yes, it is only on the first accepted program. Revising the program. So again, much more so than other forms of contract. 32.1, it requires that the contractor submits a revised program showing progress, showing the effects of implemented compensation events, how he plans to deal with delays and any other changes he proposes to make. How often? Well, the bottom line there, if you can see that, is the interval stated in the contract. So the contract data will tell the contractor you will submit a program every ... weeks. Most projects I witness are every 4 weeks or every month sometimes. But the contractor can issue one whenever they want and the project manager can ask for one whenever they want as well. So that's the overall producing of a program and what should then be in a revised program. And we touched on the importance of the acceptance. We'll come back to that at the end of this session. We've got different types of float. Now, the common question I get asked, or to me, is who owns the float? Under an ECC project, who owns the float? Can anyone offer a guess as to what they think my answer might be? Okay, some might say that's a slightly cynical view, but technically that is an answer to a specific type of float. But my answer to the question is it depends what type of float you're talking about. Because we've got total float, we've got time risk allowances, and then we've got terminal float. And your answer then fits at least one of those, which we'll see in a second. So now let's ask the individual question, who owns total float? Well, here I've got a very simple network. D and C form the critical path. A and B have what we call total float. So they can move without affecting the critical path. Now they are available to accommodate the time effects of a compensation event or lack of progress or change in sequence by the contractor. So your answer, okay, whoever gets there first, yeah, whilst I don't advocate a race, technically, yes, it was the correct answer. So it is whoever gets there first. It's shared, basically, is the more polite answer, I guess, if to try and make sure that both parties realise they've got a share of it. So it is shared under the contract. So let's see how that might pan out on an ECC contract. Here we're back to our very simple program, and we have a compensation event. So let's say it's something as fundamental as we can't have access into Area D now to start those works. So we could start A, but we can't start D, and we can't start it for 2 weeks. So let's feed that into the program. We've linked the delay in to activity D, and whilst we may be attributable to any direct cost associated with the delay in starting D, in terms of time, in terms of the delay in plan completion, well, there is no change to plan completion because we've eaten into float, total float, and it's shared under the contract, so that is allowed to happen in this particular instance. So we've rescheduled the program, there's no effect on plan completion, we'll work out what the direct cost is and put that in, if there is any, as part of that quote. That program gets issued for acceptance, and assuming there's no reason not to accept it, becomes the accepted program. Now, what happens if later on activity F is delayed and there's 2 weeks that you now need to add to activity F? We forgot the testing. We always do that, don't we? But we forgot there's 2 weeks worth of testing to go on the end of activity F. So remember, this was our accepted program, and now we've got 2 weeks worth of activities added to activity F. So what happens to plan completion in that instance? Moves out a week, and completion date stays exactly where it is. Because it's not a compensation event that's affected plan completion, therefore completion date stays where it is. So we are now planning to finish at week 13, which is a week beyond the date that we should be. Not a great news, obviously, but it's the reality at that point. And unfortunately, if nothing else changes, we're also liable for delay damages if they're attributable on this project. So there could be a week's worth of delay damages to pay. Okay, that's one scenario. Let's imagine none of that happened. And let's imagine that back at the start of the project, we delayed D for our own reason. We are waiting for some resources to come free, or maybe we just forgot to order the materials. Either way, we're going to start D 2 weeks late. Has that impacted our plan completion? Nope, we've still got a week's worth of float. So if that went in for acceptance, again, as long as there's no reason not to accept it, that becomes the accepted program. Now, let's add a compensation event to activity E. So we've added 2 weeks into activity E, and we now need to link that into F. So that, again, has pushed out plan completion, same as the first scenario, to week 13. What about completion date this time? Sorry? Yeah, that actually is going to move out a week. Now, there is a timing issue, which I can't go into the complexities today, but ultimately, if this is a compensation event that's affected plan completion, completion date will move to week 13. It can use up the last week's float, there's none left, completion date has now moved. And unlike the first scenario, we've got a week's float on what was previously critical, we've got no delay damages to worry about, and in actual fact, we've got a week's delay in plan completion to cost in the form of prelims, as we'd commonly know it. It's not what the NEC calls it, but that's the cost that we've got to put in there as well. So within this compensation event, we've also got to price for the delay in plan completion within that compensation event. There's no general prolongation or extension of time claim within the NEC suite. You have to assess it against an individual event. So you're right. Exactly as you said, it is whoever gets there first, but I repeat, please, I do not advocate a race, okay? Float is a good thing, better to do things early just in case something happens that you weren't expecting. But in order to do that, that demonstrates that you do need to be updating your schedules regularly, and I say daily, absolute minimum weekly, to be able to demonstrate the true effect. Because in that last scenario, in each case, we had a 2-week contractor delay and a 2-week employer delay. And depending on which one came first, had a massive effect in terms of delay damages or actually paying out extra cost in the form of prelims. So very important that you keep on top of those programs to capture that effect. So that's the first one, and we can come back to any other questions at the end. So that's total float. Time risk allowances. Okay, well, these are individual risks that you're going to show against each activity, and these are owned this time by the contractor, exclusively owned by the contractor. And the aim is it should give some comfort to the employer that particularly the critical path is achievable. So if you've got a critical path network of 10 activities that are each 10 days long, there you go, there's 100 days. If you were told that there's no time risk allowance whatsoever, that's the best you could do all those activities, I'd be suspecting you wouldn't be too confident on the meeting that end date. Whereas if you found that they had a select number of activities with time risk allowance in there, well, okay, they've got some built-in risk. I'm more confident that they're going to meet this deliverable. In truth, it's part of your normal tender process that you've always done. You've just never called it time risk allowance. So here we've got 200 metres of pipe to install. We've calculated that with the resources and the machines, the plant that we're going to use, we should be able to expect an output of 15.5 metres per gang per day. So that's 12.9 days. But we don't put that in the programme or the estimate. We're going to round it up to, in this case, 15 days. So that allows for weather, for risk, mechanical breakdown, things like that. Now, we're not going to do this on every activity because we'd never win another job again. If you put that 15% risk on every activity, clearly that's not what you do. But you're going to take a view. You want to keep your, at tender stage, you want to keep your price as competitive as possible. So we're only going to add risk that we really need to add. That's then not available to anyone other than the contractor, i.e. it can't be used to mitigate the effect of a compensation event. So let me just show this diagrammatically here. So if activity A has 3 days worth of time risk allowance, and I've drawn it as a blob here, I wouldn't do this in planning software, I'll show you in a second how I'd show it. So A has 3 days time risk allowance. If there was a compensation event that delayed the start of activity A, do you think then it will be fair that, well, okay, you haven't started yet, so we'll take your time risk allowance and therefore plan completion date stays? Or do you think it will be fairer that the contractor retains that and therefore plan moves out and completion date moves out? Well, yes, contractually, that is the answer. So the contractor retains the time risk allowance in the assessment of compensation events.
Do they have to define that as time risk allowance?
Well, the contract says when you submit a programme, you've got to show float and time risk allowances. The NEC doesn't quantify particularly how you do it, but to be honest, this is the simplest way I've found over the years to do it. I literally add a text column, and then just go down the programme and say, yeah, well, of that 4 weeks, the best we can ever do is 3 weeks and 2 days. Well, there you go, there's 3 days time risk allowance. Activity D, well, to be honest, we're going to do well to do it in 3 weeks, so it's 0. You don't have to have it, you just need to show what's there. And if you're showing it 0, well, that's fine. You don't want it all to be 0. That's the simplest way I've found of showing time risk.
You have to have like TRA, define that it is actually time risk rather than in a table where they've got an output and a planned duration and then just a rounding off.
Well, 31.2 says you need to show on the programme time risk allowance. So really it's a case of, you might have worked the calculation in that spreadsheet, but then you just need to take it back into the programme. I don't spend long on it. It's not the most important thing in that list, but it's an indicator. A bit like earned value, it's not the be-all and end-all to most people, but it's an indicator. Time risk allowance is another indicator. So, time risk allowance is contractor owned. This cannot be used by the project manager in compensation events, but he might try. But just be strong. Programme has to be realistic, achievable, so disproportionate long amounts of time risk allowance are unlikely to be accepted by the project manager. Some contractors like to fill all the float with something now called time risk allowance, make the whole programme critical. I wouldn't accept that programme. And the last one is what the guidance notes call terminal float. Interestingly, the main contract doesn't. It talks about the difference between planned completion and completion date. And interestingly, this again is owned by the contractor. So let's see how it might be generated. Let's update our schedule. Activity A is 4 weeks long, and we've actually finished it after 3 weeks. So we're going to reschedule this programme. Everything shuffles forward. And our planned completion is now week 11, and our completion date is still week 12. And we've got a week's terminal float now. That is issued for acceptance, and as long as there's no reason not to accept, becomes the accepted programme. Now, what happens if a compensation event then adds in a week's worth of activity to activity B? So we're going to link that back into C. So what do you reckon happens now? So when our last accepted plan was week 11 and completion date was week 12, we had a compensation event which pushes out C. What now happens to plan completion? moves out a week, and completion date, that goes as well. Because it's owned by the contractor, so what the contract says, clause 63.3, if you're really sad and want to know the clause, it's a measure against plan completion. The compensation event has affected plan completion by a week, therefore completion date moves by the same amount. For those of you who are on live projects, and that's news, look at the guidance notes for clause 63.3, and if you didn't believe me, then you'll read it in print there. So terminal float, there you go, that's the summation of clause 63.3. Completion date moves out, the amount the plan completion moves due to the effects of a compensation event. It can then only ever be brought back by acceleration. Acceleration dealt with under clause 36. And here's an example of what I think is a fantastic looking program. But then again, I would say that, wouldn't I? This is one of mine. And to be honest, it's difficult to capture everything in one single slide. As you know, programs are pretty big beasts. But this just gives you a flavour as what you need to be showing. This is a very dull program, to be honest, in terms of its tiling on the underground. So not a very exciting project. What can you tell? Well, I'm tiling the whole platform, but I've broken it down to grid lines. So I've got N5 to N10, N10 to N15. So I've not just got one big platform. Each area is broken down into lay floor screed, curing, terrazzo tile laying, grinding, access covers, etc. So I've broken it down into good level of detail, of which durations are nothing longer than 10 days, apart from curing, which is 28 days. So it's a fairly well broken down program. This was an option A, an ECC option A contract, which is an activity schedule, and your contractor's paid in accordance with their activity schedule. So I put all the costs in the program, and we're then paid in accordance with that activity schedule. When an item's complete, it gets paid. When it's 50% complete, it gets paid nothing. So very important on an option A contract, you're breaking your project down into a fair level of detail if you want half-decent cash flow on that project. Then I've got duration, start, finish, float switched on. So where float equals 0 here, then that is the critical path activities. And there's my time risk allowance on the end. Lots of zeros, but just little pockets of time risk allowance. And I've got resources at the bottom as well. So a full resource schedule program. Just a reminder, and people still ask me this, they say, well, do we really have to show float? Clause 31.2 says, yes, you do. And clause 31.3 says, if you're not showing the information the contract requires, it's a reason for not accepting the program. So if there's anything in here you're not showing, that's a reason for not accepting the program. If it's not accepted, you've got a problem then, because neither party are clear on the completion date, and hence contractor entitlement. The employer, in the absence of a newly accepted program, is entitled to assess change on the last accepted program and make their own assessment. And as we said earlier, not unlikely to be favourable to the contractor, that one. So it's important to both parties that the program is regularly accepted. Otherwise, we'll just look forward to the traditional bun fight you've always had at on other projects at the end of the job. The NEC contract is trying to avoid these disputes and protracted bun fights at the end of the project, which are very time-consuming, not much fun, apart from a few twisted QSs who love that part of the job. Most of us don't enjoy that at all. So don't get there. Make this program your key management tool that you're going to keep on top of. Anyone on LinkedIn? You come across LinkedIn? Well, we've got this group, Chris at the front, myself and Chris run this group, and it's called Project Planning and Management under the NEC form of contract. And we had what we called the champagne moment last week. We had our 1,000th member join, and we've sent off a bottle of champagne to the lucky joiner there. But it's a great group, 1,000 very professional people. You can go on here, post a discussion, and get feedback from group members. And most conversations have between 5 to 20 conversations, something like that. This one that was raised probably back end of last year now. A program has been accepted or rejected. Where does this leave the contractor? You'll notice it had the slight response of 121 comments off the back of that discussion. By far the liveliest discussion we've had. If you're bored or what I like to think motivated, it's a really good read. So if you one lunchtime, got nothing better to do, join the group and have a read of that. There's some really good material in there in terms of how you should be keeping on top of it. But a very emotive subject, and 121 people responding just shows how difficult a scenario and how people are wanting help, guidance, because they're often banging their head against the wall. Contractor, the summation of that topic, I tried to sum it up, what the parties need to do. Contractor, make sure your programme fully complies with clause 31.2 and clause 32.1 when you're revising the programme. Always show the difference between plan completion and completion date. Make sure you have a comprehensive programme narrative with each submission to explain what's happening in the programme. Have a programme review meeting during the acceptance period with the project manager. So submit it, a couple of days later, have a meeting, talk him through it, explain what the programme's showing. And if you've no response at the end of that, we'll call another meeting to find out why it hasn't happened. Employers, you've got a job to do as well. Review the programme well within the 2 weeks the contract says you've got to do it in, and give early comment. So let the contractor know. If there's no way you're going to accept it, well, tell him, so that he's then got a chance to put it right. I always say aim for a 1 week response where possible. I had a bizarre situation this week where I found a Z clause amendment that I like. I did a project and they changed the programme acceptance to 3 days. Absolutely fantastic. So there was a commitment that the employer wrote this, said within 3 days we're either going to accept or not accept. Never seen it before. I was gobsmacked. I loved it. But it shows that the employers recognise the importance of it. Give clear, specific reasons why it's not accepted. We saw the 4 reasons for not accepting. Tell them why. And also, I'm a very strong advocate of accept with comments. I'm a slight maverick in the NEC family because I think I've convinced them, but even some of I'm a consultant for NEC as well, Thomas Telford, the authors of the contract. And they were a bit reticent, well, no, I don't think we like comments. And I'm like, no, accept with comments. As long as the comments are fairly small, minor issues that can be put right before the next programme submission, we'll accept this one. So if the testing commissioning isn't as well detailed as you want it, accept this one and put that right in the next one. I'm a real strong advocate of that, because otherwise you spend several months trying to get that accepted programme. In the meantime, what do you use to assess? Well, that's the problem. So, a summary. The role of the programme within the NEC contract is significantly heightened, and hence the role of the planner. The contract actually helps the planning function as it's enforcing the normal day-to-day processes that the planner and the business should want to be initiating anyway. So when I'm on a project, even if I'm not on an NEC contract, I still do what the NEC asks, because that, to me, is good practice planning. Everyone on a project needs to be using the programme, not just the planner. Transparency, do whatever it takes to present and produce information that makes things clear and unambiguous. Work in real time, each programme is a line in the sand as to what's happened and why. Keep on top of early warnings and compensation events and associated time effects. And consider training to reinforce the understanding of the contract. Okay, that's partly what I do. I do happen to have a public NEC 3 programme workshop coming up in December running in London. So should that be of interest, it's all the stuff today and a lot more. We spend a whole day looking at early warnings, compensation events, the building up of a programme from first principles in the first place. So just happens, I only run a couple of those a year, but there happens to be one next month. So if anyone is interested, contact me via the website. So thanks for listening, and remember that beating heart of the contract. Any questions? Any other questions from the audience?
When the program is first submitted, can it have terminal float? And could a contractor, for instance, do a very tight program, very little float, and have a terminal float that would say three weeks early, knowing that any compensation event would then give them an extension of time?
Yes. So you as an employer would have to interrogate that programme and see if that's achievable. Because if all they've done is strip out the time risk allowance and said, yeah, we are going to finish 3 weeks early, but then there's no time risk allowance, well, on that grounds, I'd say that's not a reason to accept. So they could. But you have then got the power whether to accept or not. But you can only accept for a reason outside the contract, but that would be a reason. If it's achievable, then, okay, there's nothing not to accept there. Nothing not to accept. Any other questions? Chris?
Total flow. If, going back to the comment from earlier on as to whether there could be an inevitable race for who claims that total flow, and there's no disadvantage to someone wanting that, is there any particular criteria, or does the party that wants to use that total flow have to justify it in any way in order to use it? Or
it just happens. Well, it's not a positive race. Most races I'd advocate, I wouldn't, this one. A contractor shouldn't be wanting to use up that float, because what will happen, that's got 4 weeks float, so don't worry about that for 3 weeks. I don't know if you found this, but when you, on reflection on a job, the things that you didn't think were going to be the problem, they're the ones that really bit you somewhere. Okay, so the problem with that activity, it looks as though it's got float, but when you open that activity up, crumbs, we didn't realise we're going to do this, that's going to now take 2 weeks longer. So if you've already used up 3 weeks float, that now is critical, it's going past the end date. So it's not about, it really isn't about seeing who can use it up quickest, but when you're revising the programme, it is naturally going to be there. It's the logic, the way you logic link between the activities, float is the byproduct, it's saying, well, okay, the logic that you put into this program, these items can slip by a bit, the other items can't. And you're just going to be regularly updating those.
Could a contractor, though, on the basis of wanting to protect themselves from further problems down the line, perhaps put in the fact that there could be a slight delay, which means they may want to use that total float, therefore giving them a buffer for later on?
Well, it won't work as a buffer, because if they delay an activity, well, they've then got less float left. If it then goes past the end date, that's already running critical, they're then going to be into delay damages. So it is in the contractor's interest to do these non-critical items as early as possible, because that's one risk out the way. Because until they start doing that activity, they don't really know how long it's going to take. They've got a good idea, but they don't know if they're going to hit any problems. So it is in the contractor's interest to do all these non-critical items as quick as possible as well. Any other questions? Okay, well that was a planner leading a planning section that actually finished bang on time. So I thank you. Thanks for your time.